So Energy Media readers, welcome to Zoffi with Markham, and today we're going to be talking to Keith Stewart of Greenpeace. And the topic today is the federal bailout or federal support package for oil and gas. And that's the first half of the conversation. The second half is going to be all about what do we do with energy going forward after the pandemic is over, assuming it ever ends. And so welcome to Zoffi with Markham, Keith.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, look, why don't we start? I was a little surprised at the number of, environmental organizations that put out press releases on April 17th supporting the Prime Minister's package of $2.5 billion plus some liquidity support for producers and service companies. And Greenpeace was one of those organizations. So give us, sort of your argument for support for that package.
So it was qualified support. I mean, there was sort of several packages on the table, one of which was pretty much an unqualified bailout, $15 to $30 billion of support for the industry. The industry was even asking for a share buyout, for the federal government to buy shares like they did in the car companies back in 2009. This one was focused on environmental remediation. So rather than sort of expansion of oil and gas production, it was support for remediation. It's not ideal. I mean, the only good solution here involves the use of a time machine and going back to the 1980s and fixing the regime then. So what we were supporting was putting people back to work, because that's really important. I mean, we can't ignore the pain people are feeling. And I think like in the COVID response, the Trudeau governments, the provincial governments, like their first responsibility is to make sure in the short term, people have food on the table, they can stay in their homes, and they can get the healthcare they need. But when we're looking to the sort of like the stimulus recovery packages that are coming and being worked on now, it's like, okay, what is that going to look like? And so this package we'd been sort of talking to the federal government, all the environmental groups had, and industry, of course, as well. It actually talked to them a lot more than we had. And so it was like the government eventually came with this package, which was, okay, we are going to help, we're going to support the remediation. So put people back to work cleaning up wells. Ideally, the companies would pay for this themselves. A bunch of them are bankrupt. And a bunch of them also would just go bankrupt if they actually had to fulfill their obligations. So again, don't love the fact that there's grants there rather than just loans. But you have to balance sort of the support for polluter pay principle. And the federal government said this came with conditions, that the Alberta government would have to bring in real polluter pay provisions in their liability regime, and we haven't seen those yet. We're now asking the federal government, what exactly is that going to look like? Because certainly the Alberta government doesn't seem to be thinking that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. On Friday, the Premier of Alberta, Jason Kenney, announced that they were starting the well remediation and cleanup, and there was absolutely hardly any mention of the fact that the federal government was providing the $1 billion. But there was also no mention of the fact, of the reform of the asset, the liability management system that is clearly flawed. Everybody agrees it's flawed and needs to be reformed, but reform it and you push these little juniors into bankruptcy, which has sort of paralyzed the system for the last number of years. But something you mentioned, Keith, and I want to zero in on this. The Environmental Defense Fund leaked the CAP proposal to the federal government. And frankly, I was astonished. I wasn't, because CAP's climate policy released in 2018 is an awful backward-looking thing that has everything to do with rolling back environmental regulations. And here they proposed it again. And the whole thing was nothing but rolling back environmental regulations, and how they, as one commentator said, dudes, read the room. It was just not going to fly, and it didn't fly. And I was a little surprised, and I guess CAP actually, this is a humiliation for the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers to put forward a horrible proposal and then have be completely shut out on it. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I was not surprised to see that CAP proposal. I mean, they basically, every demand that they've made in the last few years, they now repackaged as, pandemic, which means, we can't afford any climate policies. And I think, in the later conversation, we'll get to, where do we go next? Because I think that is a big question. I think the oil industry just isn't facing up to the fact that the world is changing around them. But yeah, to come back to the sort of abandoned wells question, it's there's trying to actually bring in a polluter pay principle. And the way Canadian federalism works is it's provincial jurisdiction. The way the federal government gets leverage is through money. And so the federal government has told us that they were going to use that leverage, and we haven't seen it yet. That certainly wasn't in the Alberta announcement on Friday. So we've now asked the federal government, hey, what's the deal here? Sonia Savage, Minister Savage, was asked about the legislation. She said, oh, we're going to deal with that later. Right now, we just have to get people to work. Well, the federal government said there's going to be strings on that. There is going to be oversight from Indigenous organizations, from local communities. What is this actually going to look like? What are the real details there? But the other side of that is there is an environmental justice question here of you have leaking wells that are polluting people's water, their air. This has to be cleaned up. Industry has to pay for it, but there's going to be some in the short term that they're not going to be, some of them aren't going to be able to pay for. So how do we make sure that we and actually I think Martin Olszynski, professor at University of Calgary, and some colleagues put out a really good blog, I think actually on Friday, or maybe it was just yesterday, sort of looking at, okay, how do you balance those two requirements? And how can we sort of use this funding leverage to actually improve the liability regime in Alberta and set precedents that's going to work for other, like the mining industry has similar issues. So that's kind of like, that's how we were approaching this. And I think, the fact that CAP's big ask, the pages and pages, the 13 pages of demands, they pretty much got stymied, which I think is the fact that they just don't understand that the world is changing.
Well, I've argued that many times in columns and on social media, and there's a fair amount of people that agree with that argument. I want to share a little bit of information that I just received from the Export Development Corporation, which is one of the two crowns with the BDC that'll be administering this liquidity support. And on April 17th, when the Prime Minister announced that there would be expansion of the business credit availability program, he said very clearly, we're going to expand this to companies that need more money, but it's for medium-sized energy companies. And that kind of has been ignored largely in Alberta and within the industry. So I went to BDC and EDC and I said, well, okay, and the other criteria is, as a rule for those two organizations, they only will help fund businesses that were financially viable before the downturn.
And that was actually in the government's announcement that these companies had to be viable before, in the pre-pandemic phase.
So the BDC, when I asked them what financially viable did, shuffled it off and said they haven't made the determination yet. But they're the smaller player in this. EDC is the big player. And they did come back and they said, well, we are going to, the government of Canada has, sort of a criteria, and that will be interpreted by each one of the banks when they're determining whether these companies. So that leaves a little bit of fudge room. And it may be, because we know that a lot of these junior companies are on, they're looking into the abyss. They're basically insolvent, and only the banks lending them a little bit of money in their credit line is keeping them alive. So the bank, how does the bank approach this? Does the bank say, well, we're going to be generous to the juniors because we can give them some money and hopefully kick this can down the road at the federal government's expense, and maybe prices will recover and we'll all be saved and sing kumbaya around the campfire? Or they might say, okay, look, the government's given $1.7 billion for well cleanup. We can essentially push these guys into bankruptcy. Yes, we wind up taking over the environmental liabilities, but now the government has provided money to pay for those. So that's, I think, is the calculation that banks are going to be doing. And we'll see how the federal government pressures them in terms of, whether it accepts their evaluations or not. That's the way I see it. What do you think, Keith?
Well, this is another question we've just put to the federal government. Okay, how is that, economically viable test going to work? Does it include the liabilities issues that they should be responsible for under this new improved polluter pay legislation? And the other thing we said to them, okay, how are you going to improve transparency here? Because one of the big problems with EDC is it's famously opaque. And these are massive amounts of public dollars going to companies. It's not just in the oil and gas sector, right? EDC is funding right across. But there was sort of this the specific announcement for the oil and gas sector was it was for companies under 100,000 barrels per day production, and sort of like how much loan guarantee. I mean, really, this is about protecting banks first and foremost. I think I think the bank lobbyists did well out of this one, right across the board. But yeah, we've asked, what does that test look like? What kind of economic future are you looking at? Because when you look at what I find fascinating about this financial crisis compared to, say, the 2008 one, was in 2008, everyone was like, oh, we can't deal with environment stuff right now. We just got to get the economy going again. And when you look at what's coming out of, the European Union, but also, the statements today from the IMF, the stuff coming out of the International Energy Agency, it's all actually we have to use this economic crisis to build a different kind of economy, to build the clean energy economy that's going to help fight climate change. And so it's no longer sort of just the Greenpeaces of the world saying that. It's some of those people who actually manage a whole lot of money and have a whole lot of political power. And I think when Jason Kenney shrugged off that question at the press conference on Friday, questioned the loyalty of a reporter who dared ask about an energy transition. That's the kind of thing, when you're declaring the radicals, the sort of deep left radicals are the IMF and the World Bank and the European Union, and Blackstone, this is a different world that Kenney just doesn't even want to be allowed to be discussed.
Well, it's not only Kenney, because I've had conversations with what we'll call the progressive members of the Alberta Oil and Gas Company, people who are more lined up with the European oil and gas company view of the world, and they've fallen down this rabbit hole as well. I was quite surprised, actually. They're all talking about how there has to be relaxation of emission standards. There has to be relaxation of these other requirements to lower compliance costs. And they've again completely misread the room, in my opinion. So Keith, that's basically the federal buyout. I think we've had a good chat about that. Now let's turn our attention to post-pandemic view of energy. And I'm going to put, as I was saying, we have the energy declaration that's on our site. You can go and see it. It's kind of our vision for where we think the Canadian energy system has to go. But I've got a piece specifically around hydrocarbons. And my strategy that I'm suggesting has three prongs. One is lowering emissions and improving environmental performance is absolutely top-notch. That is the table stakes to continue to play in the hydrocarbon game. Number two is a shift to hydrocarbons as feedstock into material production. So non-combustion uses for hydrocarbons, like bitumen, for instance, with its high carbon content, makes carbon fiber, and there's a lot of research going on into that. So there should be a conscious strategy to begin in the future pivoting the industry over to more materials production, blue hydrogen out of natural gas, another example. If all of that happens and the industry buys into it, then as global fuels market shrink, then we can say, all right, you've earned the social license to compete for those fuels markets. If you don't do all of those things, you don't have the social license, and you're going to just have to take the consequences of what the market brings and what regulation brings. So that's our take on it, Keith. What's your take?
So we've been saying for a while, you can either kind of plan for a transition and sort of manage your way through that, or we can just global markets impose one. I look at the pandemic as kind of the coming climate transition on energy transition on fast forward. You have a drop in demand for oil and gas, which we're going to see, we can argue about when demand for oil is going to peak and start to decline and how rapidly it will decline. But if we're serious about climate change, that's going to happen. And we're also increasingly seeing the low-cost producers opening up the taps. I mean, for a long time, the Saudi strategy, for instance, was to maximize the price per barrel by keeping production low, because they viewed, okay, if we're going to sell every barrel, by the time it's all gone, we want to make sure we got the most per barrel. That is shifting, I think, because A, they don't control enough of the market anymore. with the massive expansions of production in Canada and the US. But also if they're saying, looking at this like, oh, actually, we're not going to get every barrel out. There are stranded assets. Let's make sure that we capture a bigger share of that pie. Then this is also going to be shaping energy markets for a long time to come. And if you're a high cost producer, this is not good news. So like, I would say we should be trying to manage that transition. We should be preparing for it. We know oil and gas isn't going to disappear overnight, but Jason Kenney's kind of, he wants you to believe that there's another energy boom just around the corner. We just got to get through this one, then boom again. And there will be, there will be upticks, but it's a declining trend. And we can either help communities and workers currently dependent on this industry manage that transition, or we can just let it be imposed and, look at, basically, I think, cod was at one point Canada's biggest export. We did not manage that transition well. And I think we should have learned something in this country about natural resource booms and busts and changing global market dynamics.
Yeah, I would agree with the managing the transition argument, simply because in addition to mitigating risks, and we talk a lot about mitigating risk, whether they're climate risks, environmental risks, risks to business and to jobs and so on, what we rarely talk about is opportunities. And that's why part of our piece will focus on materials production, is because there's tremendous opportunity. I've interviewed EV analysts, and we talk about range and energy density of batteries, but we also talk about the weight of the vehicles. So one of the easy ways to make your energy density work better for you is to lighten up the vehicles, go from 3,800 pounds to 3,000 pounds or 2,500 pounds. And one of the ways the industry wants to do that is carbon fiber. But they can't get a source of carbon fiber that meets their needs, a plentiful source at the right price. And the folks I interviewed at Alberta Innovates say they're 5 to 7 years away from having a process available, a commercial scaled up process that will provide cheap carbon fiber at any kind of quantities that, say, an industry like autos would need. And we don't talk about those opportunities enough. We keep fixating on fuels and not talking about these other things we can do with it.
And another interesting opportunity that's sort of sitting right at us is the federal government is about to fund a bunch of well remediation and capping. There's geothermal potential from a lot of those wells. So could we actually take these abandoned oil wells where you've actually already done the drilling and everything and turn them into geothermal heat sources for district heating or for greenhouses or something like that? So I think, there are a lot of opportunities, but it's that as long as you're convinced that the oil and gas boom will go on forever, you're not looking at those. And in fact, I couldn't quite believe it watching Jason Kenney try and answer that question. He was asked, what about an energy transition? Oil and gas is, the price has gone negative, but also there's declining prospects going forward. And he was basically in complete denial that was even a possibility. And the thing for me was when he said, I can't believe a Calgary-based reporter would ask this question. It's like, what, if you're in Calgary, you're not allowed to ask tough questions of the premier about the future of the province? It's this kind of us and them mentality, which is not going to serve Canadians, Albertans well in the long run if you're basically putting all your eggs in a basket that is rapidly fraying.
Well, the way I wrote a column about that on Friday, and my argument is that two months ago in Washington, the premier was on a panel, and he said I recognize that the energy transition is coming. And then an interview with Don Braid at the Calgary Herald, he said, I have a firm grasp of the obvious. We know that we're in an energy transition, and we're going to be transitioning off fossil fuels. So 2 months ago, he was talking about the very thing that Tom Ross, the reporter in question, that asked the question about. So today that's verboten, and 2 months ago the premier was admitting it himself. I mean, that's just hypocrisy and cognitive dissonance, and it makes no sense in any. And that's not the way we should do this. In addition to tribal politics and all the rest of it. But let's get away from politics for a minute, Keith, and talk about how we're going to manage this, because it seems to me that the industry at this point in the game is taking the International Energy Agency scenarios, and they're saying, okay, so the stated policy scenario sees the oil consumption rising from 100 barrels a day, 100 million barrels a day to 106 million barrels a day by 2040. That's a forecast. It's not a forecast. It's a scenario. And the sustainable development scenario says it's going to drop from 100 to 67. And my argument is that we should proceed as if the sustainable development scenario is what's likely to transpire, so that whatever else, if it doesn't turn out that way, we're prepared. Your take.
Yeah, so this is I've gone back and forth on Twitter and in various debates with these guys, because they keep citing the IEA scenario that says, because the IEA scenario is good. If, in the reference scenario you mentioned, where oil demand goes up, that comes with about 3.5 degrees of warming. The world has committed to keeping warming well below 2 degrees. Even their, sustainable development scenario isn't actually fully consistent with the Paris Agreement, and they're now developing a new model that would be. But, in that scenario, we actually see oil demand going down to, roughly where it is right now, by 2040. Actually, I think a little lower than where it is right now. And that's the world we should be preparing for. And again, like Greenpeace, we used to be the crazy saying, we got to do this. This is what needs to happen. And now you see, the BlackRocks of the world stepping forward and saying, well, actually, fossil fuels, they had a good run, but we think the money's somewhere else right now. So we're starting to shift. They're not going off fossil fuels right now, but they're basically saying that transition is coming. We have to prepare for it. Alberta has to prepare for it. And that clinging to the scenario of, basically business as usual is, I think, something that their shareholders should in fact be stepping up and saying is unacceptable. And if you look at, the reports, for instance, that came out of Suncor a few years ago on there's a shareholder resolution passed that said, basically give us what would your business model be in a low carbon scenario? And they used an old IEA model called the 450. And they basically said, well, if that scenario were to come true, then we wouldn't build new oil sands mines or pipelines. This was while they were building Fort Hills. And because that wouldn't make good business sense. So you have an industry which is basically betting on sort of 3.5 degrees of warming to stay viable. And that is a highly risky bet, because even if you win, you lose.
Yeah, that's a point that Professor Andrew Leach makes all the time, is that it's essentially a bet that global governments will not act on climate change. And that's a bad bet. And if you're betting billions of dollars of investors' money, it's an especially bad bet. Now, Keith, you brought up BlackRock, and energy media readers can go on our site, and I've written a number of pieces about BlackRock's January 15th letter about finance for oil and gas being tied to climate risk. But we have today with us the former Deputy Minister of Environment under the Notley government. Now, Eric Denhoff, you probably aren't expecting this, but you did write a column for us last year where you talked about going to New York and on Wall Street and talking to some of the big investment houses there, and what the message that you got about climate risk and the Alberta oil and gas industry. And I wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing as much as you can some of what you learned in that trip, sir. After you unmute your mic. Or have we lost? Oh, we've lost Eric. He was here, but he's left. So I'll give you just a little précis of what he said. The big investment houses said, what are your climate policies? Because if you don't have good climate policies, we can't sell the oil sands as an investment to our investors. Straight up, that was the message. And so this is at this point in the game, it still has not sunk into many of the oil and gas folks in Calgary that climate risk will chase away capital. If you don't manage your climate risk, you will not get capital. It's one of the reasons why the juniors are having so much trouble. They're in a capital crisis. It's because they don't have climate policy. They don't have climate risk strategies. Anyway,
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's interesting reading the various companies' financial disclosures, because some of them are kind of like clearly stating, okay, climate risk is real. Here's how we're seeking to manage it, and others like it's absent entirely. And that's going to be increasingly unacceptable. And you got pressure from shareholders, pressure from environmental groups, and I think increasingly there's going to be government regulations requiring disclosure of these risks, and that's going to start winnowing out the companies, and also hopefully trying to force some internal changes. But yeah, if you look at sort of the Exxon reports, or in Canada, Imperial's annual report just got published, I think maybe on Monday. It's just out. I've been waiting for it for a while. They're pretty clearly saying, you read vaguely between the lines, like, we don't think governments are going to do this climate thing very seriously. It's a risk, but not a big one. Some of the others are a little more progressive, but I think you still have a tiny fraction of their resources going into the alternative energy or into those kinds of diversification. And I think it's going to be like an evolve or die kind of thing for these companies. And to be fair, like I work for Greenpeace, we're trying to make sure that happens, right? We want these companies to shift into different lines of work, because if there is going to be no oil and gas industry in 2050 of any notable size, if we're going to have a stable climate and a livable climate. And there might be carbon fiber manufacturing happening, but there's not going to be, like the weirdest thing for me was when Teck put out their plan saying, oh, we're going to go carbon neutral by 2050. We're going to use electric vehicles to like haul the bitumen out of our mine, like the proposed Frontier mine. It's like, well, who do you think is buying this in like a zero emissions world?
Right. So, folks, we're going to open it up now to questions. So here, everybody's got their microphones muted. What I'd like you to do is, please, there's at the bottom of your screen, there is a little panel, and you can put up your little blue hand. And when I see that, I'll call on you for a question of Keith and I, and we'll do our best over the next 20, 25 minutes or so to answer those questions. So I don't see any blue hands yet, so we're going to keep chatting until we do see one. And
I think Raf was waving though.
Raf, are you waving for a question? Raf can never figure out the blue hand. That's the problem. Okay.
No, I was not waving, but if you put me on, yes. So
fire away, Raf.
Oh, well, it's just a general question for a Greenpeace person. Does environmental's good precedes humans good or no? That's what I want to know. What precedes? Is it intrinsic transcendent value to the environment, or you believe humans needs precede environment all the time? Just like a philosophical question.
Oh man, you're taking me back to my PhD dissertation. So I would say it's actually a false dichotomy. Humans are part of nature. We can avoid that reality for a while, but it'll come back to bite us in the butt, is basically the short form. So if you want to have healthy human society, you need to have a healthy ecology. You can extract more value than you're putting back for a while, but you can't do that forever. And I think, for instance, on the climate change file, which is, mostly what I do, this is pretty clear. Fossil fuels greatly raised the quality of life for human beings, massively, over the last century and a half. And right now they're a net negative. And we have known that for pretty much, well, some of the companies have known it for 50 years, but we've known this for certainly at least 30 years now, generally. And we haven't taken action to deal with that. So we actually have to try and seek a new kind of balance. And I think also, coming out of the pandemic, because so many of the assumptions of politics as usual have been questioned, we're into the politics of necessity. There's things we have to do to protect ourselves and protect our families that we would normally consider outrageous. If you told me I was going to be locked in the house with my wife and kids for 6 weeks in a row, fortunately we get along and my kids are old enough that they're I'm so glad I'm not locked up with a toddler. But it's this is the kind of approach I think we need to start taking on climate change. And I think a lot of, Greenpeace is also going to say, like, okay, a lot of other assumptions about how the world works, consumerism, et cetera, are things we need to question. So, that's maybe not for today, but there's a bunch of things about the way the world works that we assumed were natural that are not. And in fact, are contrary to kind of some basic laws of nature and ecology.
I want to take a crack at this because I have a little different view than Keith. I instead of putting the climate change issue, the climate crisis first and foremost, I focus on the energy transition, because if you focus on climate change, then we're advancing the energy transition in order to achieve climate goals. And I argue that the climate transition is actually well over 20 years old. It's basically, the pump has already been primed and is now self-sustaining. It's not that we will transition off fossil fuels. We absolutely will transition off fossil fuels because electric vehicles are better and cheaper. Renewables are better and cheaper. There are many, many new energy technologies around the electrification and doing things better with renewable energy that are better than fossil fuels. We're not going to transition because we're all afraid of climate crisis. That's pretty clearly, I know consumers in the Western world anyway don't operate that way, but we will transition off fossil fuels because it's better, cheaper, more efficient, and just a better experience and better product. And that process is, not only has it begun, we literally are 20 years into it, and it is inevitable. It cannot be stopped. The energy transition is going, we will look back on from 2050 to 2020, and we will be amazed at the changes that the energy transition has wrought. And so I flip it on its head, and I think of the energy transition as the accelerator pedal. Climate policy is the accelerator pedal for the energy transition. You want it faster, press harder on the policy pedal, and because the energy transition is my focus, and I think that's where we really want to go is to get to speed up the adoption of those technologies, and they're better technologies, and they're cheaper technologies.
But I mean, there's policy and there's also politics. I mean, when you look at that list of cap demands, it's basically like, let's put off this energy transition as long as possible.
Yes.
I think even the ones who understand that it's coming want to delay it, and that actually can have catastrophic results.
Now, Chris McDermott, you indicated that you had a question, so fire away.
Yeah, with respect to the orphan wells, why didn't we try the American model under Superfund, where the taxpayer pays to clean up the mess, but then there's a legal mechanism in place to go after the responsible parties to refund the money?
Well, Keith, go ahead.
So the money that's been put forward here, which is $1 billion, it's a lot of money. But in light of the overall liabilities, which are probably like at least 30 billion for wells and at least that much again for tailings ponds, it's not actually going to clean up a huge percentage of that. So I think part of what we need to do is use that money to leverage the policies to sort of put those things in place. And I think this is where we need to have the feds actually like stick to their guns and say, okay, Alberta, this was the deal. You have to fix this regime. Put those measures in place so that we actually do get it back on a true polluter pay system. I mean, we would have preferred that they were all loans. There's the federal government sort of made a political compromise there. But it's like, okay, what's the long-term impact going to be? Do we actually put us on it? Because the problem right now is we have a system where nothing's getting cleaned up. And you can put those companies into bankruptcy, but that doesn't actually deal with the problem. And this is why, I half jokingly say you need a time machine to fix this properly, but this is the thing. We actually have the system that's been broken for decades. We've all known it's broken, but it was convenient to just allow those liabilities to continue to build and build and build. And so it's like, yeah, let's try and fix this going forward. The Superfund model would be one. There's a bunch of different sort of models out there. And there's other people who nerd out on that more than I do. Like the Pembina folks have been dealing with this a long time. Regan Boychuk and the Alberta Liabilities Disclosure Project have very detailed plans. I think, but that's the kind of thing we need to see. Okay, what is the actual model going to be here to sort of prevent this from just happening over and over and over again?
I want to jump in here because, in fact, the way the Orphan Well Association has been set up, it's actually funded by industry dues. And when money was lent under the Notley government, $200 million to the OWA, and then the Kenney government lent another $100 million to the OWA, those are literally loans. They will be paid back through industry fees. And so the larger, but the issue here is the polluters got to walk away. They got to basically bad actors were enabled, and the rest of the industry paid for that. My take on the $1.7 billion that the federal government put forward is it's a big number, in part because they think that some of these juniors are going to fail, and will put more orphan more orphan wells into the inventory, and they've included enough money to clean up those as well. So rather than give money just to have people sit at home, you kind of get a 2-for-1, right? You support them and you clean up environmental liabilities. And we all just agree that we're going to take the hickey on this we're going to let these bad apples walk away from their liabilities, but fix the system so it doesn't happen again. So I think that we've addressed that issue. Rosalind Warner, you would like to ask a question. I'm going to unmute your mic. Go ahead and ask.
Hi, thanks so much. So I'm wondering about the politics of the government's remediation proposal and the funding that's gone behind it. And I wonder if you could comment a little bit on the framing of it as assistance for workers and the way in which the calculation perhaps was that providing money specifically to create jobs is in some way undermining the industry's claims that they are the ones speaking for Alberta workers, for example. And I wonder if it also might explain a certain amount of the defensiveness on the part of Kenney and others, in that they feel like that ground is being shifted underneath them, because practical policies are coming forward now to assist workers, and they really have been claiming that as their base, their political base.
Keith?
Yeah. So I think that's some good insight. It was interesting, like, what was it, 2 months ago, during the debate over the tech frontier mine, when the idea of federal funding for well cleanup was first floated, the response from the Alberta government was like, we don't need your charity, and now it's like, oh, please give us the money. And also, I think increasing, like, for a long time, there's sort of been this illusion that the oil and gas industry is this juggernaut that's sort of this massive creator of wealth and jobs, and that's sort of the one that Jason Kenney likes to play to. But I think increasingly they're coming to be viewed, by the finance sector, by large chunks of the public, as actually maybe these guys are more anchor than engine going forward. Like, in the future, this is going to be a problem. And I actually think the rest of Canada is going to have to help Alberta and Saskatchewan and Newfoundland transition these workers and these communities that are dependent on the industry right now. They've made a lot of money in the past. I wish, for instance, Canadian government, Alberta, these provinces had put aside money, say the way Norway did. But we didn't. We made that political choice. But I do think it is the whole sort of mantra of, Kenney is this weird mix of, he's talks like a free market libertarian politically a bunch of the time, but there's also a whole lot of, helping out your friends and donors that's going on here. And I think this is why it's important to, like, try and get this money directed in a way that's actually, like, putting people to work directly. So I was interested, they went with we're going to basically put people who are cleaning up wells, rather than we're going to buy shares in the companies to prop up the share price, which was the ask coming from the companies themselves. And that would have been terrible, right? Because you're basically, like, rewarding shareholders for taking these risks that have now not panned out, and people are still going to be out of work. I mean, we all remember 2008, 2009, how a lot of that rolled out.
I want to provide some background here, Rosalind, because when the NDP came into power in 2015 and launched the Climate Leadership Plan on November 22nd, 2015, they were supported by the oil and the big oil sands companies that are responsible for 80% of the production in Alberta. So we had those 4 CEOs on the stage with Premier Notley. And they did that because the oil sands companies for a long time have been grappling with climate change, and they recognize climate change, they recognize the need to support climate risk, and they see decarbonization of, excuse me, of their production as both mitigating risk from climate policy, but actually giving them a competitive advantage in the Asian markets they want to get into, which will be implementing carbon pricing and other restrictive climate policies. So in the oil patch, the oil sands companies are the visionaries and the leaders, as I argued in my book last year. Now, the problem with that is that the launch of the Climate Leadership Plan literally also launched an internecine civil war between the oil sands companies and the juniors and intermediates and the service companies and the financiers like Brett Wilson. And they had a bitter 2-year-long knockdown, drag-em-out fight over this issue of climate policy. And essentially, they beat the oil sands company CEOs up enough that a bunch of them just said, that's it, we're backing away, we just can't do this anymore, we're going to run our companies. And that's why what you're seeing now is the victory of the junior and intermediate producers in a political sense. They put Jason Kenney in as leader of the UCP and financed him and financed the UCP. So Jason Kenney talks about the industry, he's not talking about the industry. He's talking about the 20% of oil that gets produced by these little companies and the intermediates, but the industry is dominated by those big companies. But that's not their political agenda that we're seeing. And the big companies, because they don't do politics very well, they just said, all right, whatever, we'll just accept, whatever the government puts in place, we're not having this fight anymore. And I think until you understand the divisions within the oil patch itself and the bitter fights that go on very quietly in boardrooms and over scotch in the petroleum club, that's where these things are fought out. And Jason Kenney and the juniors won that battle 5 years ago, 3 years ago. So hope that answers your question or provides some insight. Let's go to Tony Blake. I think you're next up. If we can get can you unmute your mic, please? And nope.
There we go. Sorry. Where is the last barrel of petroleum fuel going to come from? High cost producer like Fort McMurray or Saudi Arabia?
I don't know. But I wouldn't bet on thinking high cost producers are going to have the last barrel. I mean, Jason Kenney, it's interesting when he was talking about how, oh yeah, there's an energy transition coming and the last barrel should come from Alberta. I mean, in the downturn after 2008, 85% of the projects canceled globally in the oil sector were in Alberta. And I mean, in some ways they're weathering the current downturn reasonably well, but that's because, the big mines are tough to shut down. And certainly the in situ is really hard to shut down in a quick way. But I would say the real opportunity here is in that low carbon future. Alberta has some of the best renewable energy potential in the country. Wind, solar, geothermal, Alberta's number 1 or number 2 in terms of potential. This is where that economy could be going. There's also sort of things like the carbon fibers, which is a different type of ways of thinking about how to use hydrocarbons rather than burning them and putting the CO2 up into the air. It's if you're thinking, okay, we want to. So just a step back. I've been reading company reports on this stuff for a long time, and what's interesting was it's gone from oil demand will always increase, no reserves are stranded, and then groups like Carbon Tractor kept hammering away at them, and then it's like, okay, some reserves are stranded, but not ours. And basically every company and every jurisdiction that produces oil is saying somebody else's reserves are stranded, but not ours. And this is where it's kind of like, okay, do do you really want to take the risk that you're going to be the last, the last company standing, as I think Suncor calls it? Because that's a pretty big bet to take. And if, Jason Kenney says, oh, we have the best oil. I would love it if global markets work depending on who had the best social and environmental standards. And Greenpeace, often does things like Forward Stewardship Council to try and reinforce that, but that's not typically the way markets work. And particularly for an undifferentiated product like crude oil and its products, where it's very hard to track, that would be an interesting kind of like label to try and put on it. Which is why I think you're sort of seeing out of the juniors, the oil patch, sort of the petro patriots. They're sort of like stoking with Jason Kenney this whole sort of like what I call petronationalism. It's like, our identity is oil and gas, and any challenge to oil and gas or any suggestion that, we're going to use less of it is you're saying that I'm a bad person and I'm worthless. It's like, no, we're not saying that. We're saying the world is changing. We need to change. Canada, we need to support each other through this. But denying a problem doesn't make it go away.
I want to take a crack at this, Tony, because I addressed this in my book. And I basically, to talk about global oil markets isn't instructive. You need to break it down into what Canada actually produces. Canada produces just over 4 million barrels a day. And most of that is heavy crude oil. It's like 80% of it is heavy crude, not conventional crude that is produced in like light sweet crude that's produced in shale basins or in Saudi Arabia. So where we're competing on this in this market is in the 10.5 million barrel a day heavy crude market. So Venezuela, Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, and to some extent Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. Those are the competitors in that market. And the question becomes, can the Alberta producers of heavy crude and bitumen, can they produce at a low enough cost and a low enough carbon intensity, because that's absolutely critical as we go forward into markets that have carbon pricing applied to them and other restrictive climate policies. Can they do that? Well, the oil sands companies themselves will say in their reports over and over again, that's our goal, to be cost and carbon competitive. That is their mantra. And they also talk about the best barrel principle. They want to be the best barrel for the market, best barrel for the environment. Will they get there? That's their goal, but we don't know. If they do stand a very good chance of being the last company standing or the last basin standing in the heavy crude oil market. But we're a long ways away from seeing that. And that's one of the reasons why I argue for a major pivot into materials is because of the uncertainty, of risk mitigation, as well as an opportunity seizure kind of strategy. So one more question here. Let's go to Zach Trolley.
Everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about, you just mentioned Canadian companies want to be the last person to produce a barrel of oil, and the contradiction between companies holding on as long as possible for the transition, but everyone knowing it has to come. So we're really being laggards in this whole thing, hoping that, we're all pulling straws. We're just hoping that we don't get the short straw, which is a terrible game to play when you can literally just like walk up and play a different game. So how do we as citizens, as people in Alberta, talk a coherent message about, instead of holding on and praying for a next boom and being the last, providing the last barrel of oil, what about being the first on the transition path? How do we change that narrative?
Keith, before you start, I have to jump in because the obvious answer to this is read Energy Media. This is literally our mission, is to report on and write about the energy transition and climate change and how it applies to the Canadian energy system. And I wrote a book about it. We've got the Energy Declaration out. I have got like hundreds of columns that have addressed various aspects of this. But I mean, nobody goes through my archives, so that most of you won't be aware of that. But literally, this is what we do. That very question, Zach, is our raison d'etre. Keith, over to you.
I mean, one of the interesting things is people assume that sometimes we talk about Alberta as like this monolithic entity. It's not. And polling shows actually a majority of Albertans support a transition off of oil and gas, and they support governments taking measures to facilitate that. So, when Jason Kenney says, we can't even consider that, he's not actually speaking for majority of Albertans, according to what the polls tell us. I also like to point out that, we have this whole campaign against foreign-funded environmentalists. And to be fair, Greenpeace has received funds from global foundations to support our work on climate change, oil and gas. I looked it up. It was, over the last 12 years, it's averaged 2% of our revenue. In fact, we've got a lot more money from Albertans than we ever did from, international foundations. So, it's not like Albertans are, some of them are already there. And it's, I think it's also, but it's a question of sort of how do we sort of help ease this transition. And I think, some of this is going to have to come from Albertans. I mean, I was born in Alberta. I still have family there, but, I'm talking to you from Toronto. But I actually look at the great work being done by some local activists. When you look at groups like Iron and Earth, which is oil sands workers who want to be part of that transition, want training to make that transition. I love the people at Climate Justice Edmonton. The fact that, the Premier's office regularly attacks them as individuals, calls them out. They're currently, the UCP is currently running a fundraising campaign opposed with, using a picture of them supporting a Green New Deal. It's like they're doing great advertising for Climate Justice Edmonton and the Green New Deal. And they're saying, this is, we got to stop these crazies. It's like, well, actually, I mean, the Green New Deal is supported by Joe Biden, by, the European Union is talking about doing a Green New Deal and bringing in carbon tariffs as part of that. This is the kind of stuff that's now coming out of the IEA and the IMF. It's like, this is, I think part of it's sort of bursting through that bubble. And this is something where I think people in Alberta can really help with that, because when it's coming from outside, it's, you have the group that are sort of promoting this petronationalism and say, it's outsiders trying to change us. Well, actually, there's a lot of Albertans who want to change. And I think, the more they speak up and sort of, talk to friends, family, work with these other groups, that's going to help really change the dynamic, because it's getting increasingly hard to sort of maintain the fiction that the world, that another boom is just around the corner.
This is a good time to plug tomorrow's Zoffy, which is our guest will be Professor Melanie Thomas from the University of Calgary, and she's going to be talking about a survey that she's done on Albertans' attitudes towards energy transition. Terrific insights into some of it supports what he said, but also really delves into some of what the conservatives, sort of the petro-nationalists, as you call them, what they think about the energy transition and why they hold those views. So really good stuff if you want to join us tomorrow. Now, I want to jump in here because you cannot understand this question, Zach, unless you understand the political culture within the C-suites of Calgary. And there is a tremendous laggard, most of them are laggards, let's put it that way, on climate change and energy transition. I have had many debates with CEOs and vice presidents and people in the service industry and so on who either deny that the energy transition exists or who will say that it's, it's 50 years away. We're talking about 2100. Why should we worry about that now? They are not grounded in data. They are not grounded in evidence. And I can tell you that because I've interviewed experts, hundreds of experts on this from around the world. And the data says that we are in an energy transition. That is not the political culture in Calgary. It is steeped in petro-nationalism and climate denialism, and is really ignorant. In fact, Dave Collier, the former Shell Canada executive and CEO of CAP, talks about how these executives look at things through the Alberta lens. Everything goes through the Alberta lens. It doesn't matter what's happening in the big world around them if it doesn't affect, how it affects Alberta, and their self-interest is everything. And it colors their culture and it colors their view of these things. And so, Zach, to address your question, in addition to reading and supporting energy media, which thank you very much, we appreciate your support. In addition to that is take part in the conversation. Read our stuff, get an argument, get the data and the evidence so that you and thousands of others, if you come into the conversation with us and support us, we can begin to change the way people think and talk about energy and about the energy transition. But, you know, at this point, I've been a lonely voice for 5+ years on this issue, and I'm slowly starting to see some change, but we need that tribe to be bigger. We need our tribe to be as bigger as their tribe. And then we can start changing the conversation. So that's kind of my take on it. Keith, I want to thank you. We're just hit 11 o'clock Mountain Time, so we're going to wrap this up. Keith, thank you very much for this. We really appreciate it. Very interesting conversation, and we certainly do want to have you back for a Futures Office.
Love to do it. Thanks.